Keisha Millett. Mr. Buzz, were you going to have a colleague join you this morning?
It looks like he might be frozen up, but why don't we just go ahead and get started?
She's at the Justice Center, but no, sir. No, sir. She's at the Justice Center, but she won't be here.
Very good. Well, we're very appreciative of the contributions that you and the center have made to the working group's process. And we're looking forward to your comments and your presentation this morning. Good morning to the working group. It's good to see you. We are coming together after a very eventful and jam-packed week last week. I think that our working group session last Tuesday was incredibly intense. We heard some exceptional presentations from members of the Department of Public Safety, in fact, from the Commissioner, from Sheriff McFadden at Mecklenburg County, Sheriff's Office, and Audrey Nellis from the Sentencing Project in Washington, D.C. I think that was incredibly helpful. If folks have had an opportunity to review the minutes, I assume we have. Are there any questions or comments from the minutes of last week's meeting? If not, do I have a motion?
This is Mike. I move we approve the minutes.
Thank you, Mike. And is there a second?
I second.
Thank you, Mary. We'll call a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Raise your hand. Aye. Seeing no opposition, the minutes will be adopted. We're intensely grateful for the guests who have come to describe the collateral consequences work that's been done work in that important area that's been done by some statewide partners. I've just been impressed by the PowerPoint presentation that Mercedes has put together. It sort of brings together some incredible work that clearly has taken a good deal of time to compile. And Mercedes, I'm going to turn this impressive panel over to you for introductions, but I'm especially looking forward to hearing more about the Statewide Council on Collateral Consequences, that collaborative, and the recommendations that they have put forward. And for us, the working group, to learn more about those proposals and to see how we can further and endorse that good work. Mercedes, would you introduce the panel for us?
Yes, thank you. So we've got Irene Lawrence with the North Carolina Department of Public Safety. She's a program coordinator with the Reentry programs and adult programs. Daniel Bose with the Justice Center, and he's the director of their Fair Justice Project, and Melissa Radcliffe, who is the director of our Children's Place, that works specifically with children and families in the reentry field. And what I hope to do today is very quickly have Daniel go over a couple slides what we're talking about when we refer to as collateral consequences, and then present to you guys this slate of what are 5 total recommendations, one of which encompasses many, many recommendations. Talk about them very, very briefly, and then we can turn the discussion over to catch up about what we've been doing over the last couple of weeks. So turning it over to Daniel. Daniel, I'm going to, if you guys check on your chat box, there's a link there to the collateral consequences document that we've been working on in document form. I'm going to turn it over to Daniel here to, again, go briefly over some slides, and we'll jump into the recommendations real quick.
Yeah, thank you, Mercedes. And sorry for the technical difficulties. Had to get on by phone. And so I really want to first thank y'all for taking up this issue. You know, I've been working with the North Carolina Second Chance Alliance and with the State Reentry Collaborative for going on 10 years now. Well, with the Second Chance Alliance, obviously the SRCC is a newer effort, but only the latest iteration of really an effort that Nicole Sullivan at DPS and others have led for a long time. You know, we see the same sort of racial inequities in collateral consequences as we do throughout the criminal justice system. And so I was hoping to just do a bit of an overview there and then talk about some of those civil disabilities. So when you look at criminal records in North Carolina, we know that there are at least 2 million people who have a criminal record. And it's actually much more than that. That 2 million figure comes from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And that's only criminal records where there is a fingerprint. And so there are plenty more than that where, you're talking about traffic tickets or situations that are, older than generally 1970, and they're in local courthouses and pop up every once in a while. But generally around the country, what you see is about 1 in 3 adults who have a criminal record. And so what we've seen is a phenomenon, especially in the last 20 years since 2001 and September 11th, when there was a huge focus on criminal background checks. And so these collateral consequences are much more severe and much more impactful on people of color than they ever have been before. Next slide, please. Now, when I talk about collateral consequences, the sort of broadest definition is any sort of civil disability or disqualification or private prejudice triggered by a criminal record. Now, it's important to realize that what I've seen over the past 10 years is that it doesn't really matter what the record is. In some ways it does, that somebody's just convicted of a felony, but I think people are consistently surprised that dismissed charges continue to show up on records and give rise to many of these disqualifications, whether you're talking about housing or employment, that we see with the convictions. What this slide is meant to show is that not only do you have this huge amount of criminal records in North Carolina that are disproportionately impact people of color, but also the civil disabilities really affect all aspects of individuals' lives. Now, these are actual civil disabilities, so these are imposed by the state. They're in statutes. And the collateral consequences assessment tool created by the UNC School of Government is a great resource to actually each one of these is linked to the actual statute, talks about whether the disqualification is mandatory or discretionary. And really what this is meant to show is just a sample of, again, how much this impacts people's lives. I'll just say that, when I think about how broad and far ranging these disabilities are, I just wrote down some thoughts very quickly and thought, you're talking about private employment discrimination where, and I'll talk about that in a second, but, where individuals, again, are denying people jobs, not based on an individualized assessment, but just based on the fact that a charge or conviction shows up on the record. We have huge problems with secondary and post-secondary education, whether you're talking about the justice involvement triggering somebody to be suspended from school, high school or college, or disqualification from financial aid. Occupational licensing, 1/3 of jobs in North Carolina require some sort of occupational licensing. And the majority of those disqualify people based on criminal records. As I talked about later, we've been able to rein that in with the Freedom to Work OLB reform bill that passed last year, thanks to the SRCC and Second Chance Alliance. But that's still a huge issue with implementation. Housing is probably the most severe issue. Where, we did a survey, I went around with Bill Rowe to places in Raleigh as part of the KEY program for the Housing Finance Agency and asked people their criteria. And so, one just that comes to mind is that they were automatically disqualifying anybody who had a felony conviction for 99 years. It didn't matter what. And that was a property that had 10,000 beds across the state. They had a policy of excluding anybody who had a misdemeanor for 25 years, and they automatically excluded anybody who had a dismissed charge for 7 years. And they took the time to note that if they could get records that were further back on dismissed charges in 7 years, which they're not allowed to look at beyond that under FCRA, that they would, and they would disqualify people based on that. Disqualifications based on public benefits, which I think y'all have heard about. I personally, as a child of incarcerated parents and someone who was served as a GAL, I'm excited that Melissa Radcliffe is here. I think an issue that needs a lot more focus is the intersection of the child welfare system and criminal justice involvement. I've seen the child welfare system not know how to react to a parent who's in front of them, who gets in subsequent criminal justice involvement. they don't know how to react to that, or if they do, it's a complete reaction. And then I'll just end this part by just acknowledging fines and fees is a huge issue. Extending people's probation, sending them into debt cycles, having to choose between whether you're going to lose your license or pay your bills is a huge issue. The sex offense registry, I don't even need to go into that. It's sort of self-explanatory how dramatic it is and impact on somebody's life. And just like with the criminal justice system, what we've seen is a complete sort of growth, or sort of overreach that was not intended when it was set up. And so I'm glad to talk about any of these, but for now I'll move to the next slide. And so those were civil disabilities, but these are, and those are in the statute. But as I said before, there are private disabilities. These show that employers, again, are denying based on dismissed charges, misdemeanors, felonies. And especially in the employment context, it seems like there really is no sort of expiration date of when employers or landlords are willing to say, okay, that was a lifetime ago, or that was years ago, or whatever. Again, the biggest problem is that there is just no individualized assessment of who that person is now and what risk they pose. That person in a very real way becomes their criminal record. And if we look at the next slide, you'll see that if y'all don't look at anything else, I would hope you take away this, that just like, these collateral consequences based on the disproportionate impact or the disproportionate number of criminal records in the Black community for many reasons, collateral consequences are going to impact people of color more. But even here we see that on an individual level, it actually, the consequences are more severe. This was a famous study that was done by Diva Pager, who, because of this study, became a Harvard professor, but was not a Harvard professor when she wrote this. And it looked at the impact of a criminal record by race. And so they basically applied to 300 employers in Milwaukee, and then they replicated it in New York a couple years later, and had identical resumes among 4 testers. 2 of the testers were white, 2 of the testers were Black, and 1 white tester and 1 Black tester each identified as having a single 7-year-old nonviolent felony conviction. And then they called these employers again with the exact same resume. And the call and the rate of callback was what you see below, where 34% of the time the white applicant with no criminal record got a callback. If the white applicant had a felony conviction, they got called back at half the rate, but still were called back more than the African-American applicant with the exact same credentials and resume. They were still, but no felony conviction. But already starting at that point where they're only, where people of color or Black people in this situation are only getting called back 14% of the time, then when you add the felony conviction on it, it still had a larger impact. Where and one thing that I hope you take from this is really that for Black people who have felony convictions, and especially Black men, the labor market is often completely foreclosed to them. Next slide, please. And I'll just, in my portion of this, initially, I think it's with just an overview of the collateral, I'm forgetting the name of our group, Mercedes, the State Reentry Council Collaborative. I've only been serving on it for 3 years. But yes, it is. And so I serve as a legislative liaison there, and I'll just say that when y'all are looking at these recommendations, realize that, we are proud of these recommendations and the process. It included a lot of input by directly impacted people. That's one of the things I think the SRCC has done well, is include voices of impacted people. Even when, those conversations become heated, I feel like it's always been a place where we can talk these issues out. And in 2018, we basically spent the whole year in work groups coming up with these recommendations. And I think they are good recommendations. And I'm glad for the successes we've had, but I do want to acknowledge that that was a conversation that happened 2 years ago. And so as far as these recommendations go, I'm sure the people at this table are more aware than anybody of how much the conversation has advanced. And so I do think it is worth looking at the SRCC recommendations, but I don't think this group should feel sort of, too deferential to those recommendations to say, oh, these people thought about it for much longer. We did think about it for a long time, but I think that some of those recommendations could go further because the conversation has advanced over the past 2 years. And then the last thing I'll say is that the freedom to work was a huge issue. We do see that at least on reentry, that there is huge bipartisan support. Sarah Stevens, who is about as conservative as you can get in the House, was the sponsor of the Freedom to Work bill. And really, that's what we call a fair chance bill, where it said that all occupational licensing boards have to take certain procedures and consider certain things when examining a criminal record, and installed other protections there. And that's one way to deal with collateral consequences. Another way is just to get rid of the record. And that's what we see with the Second Chance Act. That's been a huge step forward, and that's around expunctions. And I'll end there, Mercedes. Oh, sorry, no, I won't. So this is generally, when I think of collateral consequences, just how you can deal with it. The first is to, as I said, eliminate the criminal record. What's giving rise to this? And this is about forgetting versus forgiving, is how it's talked about a lot, where an expunction is truly forgetting. There are problems with expunction, and there's ways to make that system better. There needs to be more access to it. But right now, that has been a lot of focus has been put on expunctions at the legislature. Second thing would be limiting how a decision maker reviews the criminal record. You see this with both the Fair Chance Occupational Licensing law that passed, but also the governor just put out an executive order for state for individuals who has control over with a lot of these fair chance protections. And again, that's not about necessarily, it's not about forgetting, but it's about putting context in there and really doing an individualized assessment. You could also, as I said, there are about 1,000 civil disabilities in the North Carolina statutes. There needs to be an effort to eliminate many of those and really ask, how does this collateral consequence make our community safer? And the answer will be a lot of times that it won't be. There is no reason to have the drug tax these days. It was wrong back then, and it's wrong now. There's no reason to disqualify. When we look at people having a license suspended for 15 years on average because they couldn't pay court costs, there's really no good public safety reason for that. And then, and related to that, what you could do is also prohibit discrimination of private employers. That's been a huge line in North Carolina between public and private. And there's been a real reluctance to limit the ability of private employers to discriminate. And instead, that's why there's been a focus on expunctions. And then the final two things are obviously a huge issue is resources, guidance, mentorship, having impacted people guide other impacted people, but also having just good information. And then finally, the reason that I do not like expunctions that much, despite the fact that I spent my entire career working on them, is that it's sort of like a cheat for the broader community. That at the end of the day, we have to come to a realization about what we think about a criminal record and what it means, and who somebody is with the criminal record, and really in a way that destigmatizes the population. And obviously that has a lot to do with understanding the racist roots of parts of the criminal justice system. And so that's one of the broader efforts of the North Carolina Second Chance Alliance. But thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So these are the recommendations on your screen in more detail in the document that is linked here and also in the chat box. Very briefly, I just want to go over what they are, and we can delve into them a little bit more detail with some of our speakers.
Mercedes, let me ask you this question. Daniel mentioned that many of the recommendations from 2018 would benefit from some reevaluation given the discussion statewide and nationally. Are you aware of how those modifications might be made? Is that something that you have?
Irene can speak to that. Irene, can you tell us the status of the recommendations and how they're kind of ongoing? And I think I'd ask maybe Daniel to input if he thinks these are in a position to kind of go forward and be adapted as we go, or if, yeah. Irene?
Yeah, I think that would be, there's plenty of room for discussion there. And I think Daniel could probably speak more to like which of the legislative ones especially maybe could be pushed further. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the process, so since the recommendations were finalized at the end of 2018, we've been starting to implement them through these implementation teams. So the legislative team is focused on recommendations that are legislative in nature, and then the executive team is focusing on ones that have executive agency input, et cetera. And then there's a communications team that's focusing on communications level recommendations. So I think it would be a conversation for like each of those teams individually to be able to reassess. And you know, we're having conversations within each team now about how to prioritize for next year. So I think that would be part of that conversation, is which ones can we push further.
Okay. Well, I don't mean to delay this morning's conversation, and perhaps we'll just put a footnote on that for offline follow-up. Thank you. And Mercedes?
I have to say, I do know that the SRCC is one of the, I want to say it's one of the named groups in the executive order where there's supposed to be kind of a continued relationship. And we have a member, Kerwin Pittman, who's been kind of a liaison with that group. So, but really briefly, let's go back to the 5 recommendations as they stand right now. And the first one is about voting. It's the collateral consequence of voting. And it is ultimately of extending voting rights to everyone, regardless of felony conviction. Right now, if you have a felony conviction or are on probation or parole, you are restricted from voting until that's lifted. And so that's the first recommendation. The second one is repealing provisions denying SNAP benefits for those convicted felonies. And that would require amending the statute to opt out of a certain federal provision. We've had a lot of public comments on that particular recommendation. Third recommendation is coming regarding to hearing fees. So we've talked a lot about fines and fees in the context of the criminal court, but there are also hearing fees that are imposed by the DMV. This recommendation is asking to amend this particular statute 2024.1C to allow for the waiver of license restoration fees and the service fees after a failure to appear. We have a recommendation that Daniel may be able to speak a little bit on about reforming the patrician process so that individuals with multiple convictions across multiple counties only have to petition for a certificate of relief in the county of their most serious conviction, rather than separately in each county. And then that 5th recommendation is adopting a series of recommendations that are made by the Statewide Reentry Council. These recommendations are much easier to see if you pull up the document that we are working on. But kind of moving on to this next slide, again, I'm going to leave it up to discussion now. And if you guys want to talk about these a little bit, or my theory was that we were going to put these out to a survey, and Henderson, you can tell me what you want to do, put these out to a survey kind of tomorrow on getting your all's input via comment on redlining the document that we have access to, if you have access to it, or completing the survey. So right now, this is extending voting rights. This one is repealing the federal SNAP benefit prohibition, allowing a waiver. So currently, as it is right now, the DMV is not permitted to waive hearing fees for people. And these hearing fees can stack up, stack up, stack up. So this recommendation is amending the statute to allow the DMV to waive those fees.
Well, I'll say this, I was not able to open up the link that you helpfully opened up this morning for me, Mercedes. So I think it would be helpful for the members to actually open up that document, review the 34 recommendations of the collaborative. I think we've got a few moments now to entertain discussion before we move on to the more general discussion part of our agenda. Can you say a word about this election, the first recommendation? Would that authorize individuals who are currently detained or incarcerated to vote from prison?
It would if that was what if that was how we wrote it to be. And I think it's open to discussion. But
is that the recommendation coming from the collaborative that?
No, the first 4 recommendations are not coming from the collaborative. The ones that are in the so if you'd like, I can pull up the document, which is what I was about to do. So if you look here, these first 4 recommendations are recommendations that do not come out of the collaborative. The rest of these recommendations regarding pending charges, employment-related rights, the driving license, DMV, children and families, and reentry resources. And we go through them very briefly in these slides if we give about 5 to 10 more minutes on the topic. We go through select one of these with our speakers. And these are the ones that, again, we can put forward in more detail. You guys can have time to review it either in a survey format or on the document, however you prefer.
Well, if you can productively go through this in the next 5 minutes, that would be to give us a taste of how that slate of recommendations compares with what our guests are challenging us to do.
Okay. So going back to look briefly on this, the 5 recommendations, as I said, kind of broke down into these 5 areas: pending charges, employment-related rights, driving-related recommendations, children's and families, and resources. We've pulled out some select recommendations that I was going to ask Irene to speak on. Irene, real briefly, if you could just kind of talk on these and the 2 or 3 that we pulled out.
Yeah, sure. So there was a whole group of recommendations that didn't fit neatly into other categories, and we decided to call them reentry resources. And these are recommendations that require, in general, greater prioritization of reentry issues in the form of usually more money or just more attention. So I split this big group of recommendations into 3 kind of general buckets: establishing new programs, expanding existing programs, and communications changes. So all these recommendations that I'm going to go over deal with people's basic needs upon reentering, and they're all important. But yeah, like I said, I'll just highlight the first, like what I see as the top one in each bucket. And I tried to highlight one from each major life area. So education, healthcare, and housing. And as we were saying earlier, all of these, like even though hardly any of these recommendations explicitly are about racial equity, they all have racial equity implications. And we need to consider that as we implement them, especially since the executive order explicitly required the SRCC to consider racial equity in our work. So with that in mind, with the, so in what I call the establishing new programs bucket, the one I pulled out as I think is really important is hiring an employee within DPS to maintain a guided pathways pilot that would map all the educational programs at all North Carolina prisons and jails. And this would really help with the educational piece of reentry planning by giving DPS a clear map of all of these resources. And this is timely because of the passage of HB 463, which allows DPS to use state funding for associate's degrees again, which we've been banned from doing. All right, let's keep going, just in interest of time. So the second bucket that I called expanding existing programs. This is an example of one program that works very well, but really needs more funding. I thought the housing one was most urgent because if you don't have safe housing, you can't manage your other needs upon reentry. And this one is appropriating new funding to hire both a housing support specialist and a peer support counselor in each of the state's 17 local reentry councils, as well as funding 3 months of rental assistance for returning citizens. So the way this would work is housing support specialists help returning people find and maintain housing in the public and private rental market, while peer support counselors provide that credible support for the returning individuals based on their lived experience in the justice system. So these two parties would work together to provide housing for people through the LRCs. And then the next one The third kind of bucket that has to do with more administrative and communications changes. Yeah, so let's get this part. So the one that I wanted to highlight here deals with healthcare. And this is specifically sharing data between DPS and DHHS to enable more effective enrollment and delivery of Medicaid services to people currently and formerly incarcerated. And this is another reentry resource issue. This recommendation has an increasingly high level of salience because of the COVID world is exposing the inadequacy of current healthcare resources for everyone, but especially for the formerly incarcerated population. So those are just the ones that I want to touch on that really deal with the resource needs for reentry issues.
Thank you so much, Irene. And then the last one I pulled in was one that was related to children and family resources, and it had to do a little bit with about what Daniel touched upon, with was having DPS working with DHHS and also DSS and the county DSSs and county guardian ad litem programs to make sure that they're improving the resources, policies, and procedures that can help incarcerated parents and children more effectively maintain relationships when they're incarcerated. And that, I think there's a series of recommendations that Melissa is able to kind of speak on if you guys have any specific questions on those block of recommendations that have to do with children and families. Other than that, we can open it up to just questions for our guests, or Henderson, if you'd like to move on and talk about what we've been working on.
Can I ask, since we have Irene and Daniel here, to respond to Henderson's question about what they would like to see with regard to voting rights and criminal records. We're going to have to, I assume we'll come up with a recommendation. So I would like their input on that.
Yeah. I'm glad to take a stab at that. I think the question is, what does it mean to commit a crime in America today? And obviously our answer, past and present, has been that you are a second-class citizen in very real ways. Like you're actually in some ways stripped of your citizenship for that period. It's not, obviously what's been getting a lot of attention is that the 13th Amendment doesn't completely outlaw slavery. It just says that, the person has to have committed a crime or something. And so I think that's really that's one aspect of this question is, why do we have that calculation that if you commit a felony, and again, people at this table, I think, understand how many felonies there are out there. And again, the prison population has exploded, has quadrupled since 1970. So I think that's one of those harder questions is, why should someone be stripped of their civic life because they're convicted of a felony? And again, most people who are convicted of felonies don't go to prison. They're in the community, but can still not vote. The other aspect of this is what we saw a few years ago in 2016, where because 400 people did vote who were disqualified from voting because they were still on paper, they were still serving their sentence. Now, I can tell you from the advocates who reached out to those individuals that they were not intending to commit voter fraud. They just didn't know about it. And yet the elections board sent out 400 referrals to local district attorneys, and several of those district attorneys prosecuted individuals for voter fraud. And as much as we get out there and tell people, oh, you can vote when you finish your sentence, the fact that those prosecutions are going on, I cannot overstate how chilling that was. And so that's another aspect of this is actually the voter suppression, even when people do have their actual ability to vote restored. And so I think that's a key aspect of this.
And I was going to add to that. I know in 2016, at least, there were many counties, even states, that were decided by the narrowest of margins, and the number of people whose vote was restricted were often far higher numbers than that. And just so it can't really overstate the power of just of making sure that people with convictions are well, ideally that they never lose it in the first place.
Thank you.
This is Josh. I mean, there are different places to draw the line. There's currently in North Carolina, it's either you're convicted of a felony and you're serving your sentence in prison, or you're out in the community on post release. And you could certainly draw the line at allowing anyone who's out in the community on post release to be able to have their voting rights restored. I think 2 states allow people who are incarcerated to be able to vote from prison.
Both New England states, Josh?
Yeah, I think it's Maine and Vermont.
Right. And well, it's interesting to observe the pattern of race on these decisions and for which states prioritize disabling folks with convictions.
And then that brings up the question that we were talking about, you know, if someone's probation is extended for monetary reasons or something else, that at what point would their voting rights be? You know, right now they wouldn't get their voting rights back until, you know, if you owe all this restitution, we're going to extend your probation for another 2 years.
Well, that got solved.
Yeah, Judge, that was there was just a lawsuit on that. The state lost, and there's some 5,000 to 7,000 people for whom their probation was only because of their fines and fees. And those people have been contacted by the State Board of Elections. And
so that's the one that's going on right now then, isn't it?
Yeah. So, but those folks have had their voting rights restored.
That's the one I saw on the national news, I think. Okay.
That's exactly right. But there's ongoing litigation about the broader issue.
Yeah. With probationers and whether, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Mercedes, this has been an incredible conversation. And responding to Jasmine's challenge, how do we convert this challenge to some operational process for us to survey the group? And I realize that's putting quite a burden on you and the staff. But I think I would like to transition from this conversation to a more general conversation, so that if there are members that have questions that they would like to put to our guests on the collateral consequences discussion, we're free to do that. But I would also like to open up the floor to members to bring back issues that we discussed over the last 2 weeks. I'm particularly thinking that last week we had some intense conversations regarding prison discipline. We've had continuing conversations on fines and fees, although we're pretty advanced on that. There was a fairly amazing public comment session last week where we got some helpful and productive input from important stakeholders that are not represented in this working group. And I think processing some of that input would be helpful. So let me just open it up to the members if they've got either questions, concerns, or comments from these prior discussions that would be helpful to air here.
So I'm not sure how we're structuring this. If we want to go through the order on the slide here, let me get started though, because I want to talk about something that I think incorporates a little of what we just heard, and also some of the public comments. And I wanted to just revisit just a little bit our prison discipline recommendation. And I'm wondering if we could broaden it just a little bit to incorporate some other issues that have been raised in public comment, or some issues that were raised this morning. For example, I think 2 of the recommendations that we heard this morning, I guess it's from the longer reentry sheet, involved enhancing DPS's ability to sort of do vocational and track vocational and educational programs. And then another one about enhancing DPS's ability to allow parents to visit with their children. I know they have some limited programming that allows that, but it would be great if they could expand that. It's so important. So those are two issues that maybe could go into with this overall making prison better recommendation. Maybe we rename it. And then the other thing I wanted to raise in relation to this was, we had the public comment session on this past Friday. I don't know, the days get away from me. And there was a public comment from a person who's living on death row named Lyle May, and he relayed it through two young women who I guess he's met somehow while he's been incarcerated. But I got to wondering about whether there were other incarcerated people who had reached out on various issues. And I spent some time on the SharePoint and looked at some things and talked to some folks. And I did find really there was a couple of things, but there are two really thoughtful letters from incarcerated folks. And I think Mercedes shared them last night. And I would encourage everybody to go read them because these two guys spent a lot of time on this effort. And they've made some meaningful policy proposals, right? One is that they both talk about their names, hold on a second, are Mr. Well, you have the letters.
King?
They talk about Mr. King and I'm losing the other one now, right? Mr. Hart, Mr. King and Mr. Hart. But in particular, they go into, both of them describe these sort of rehabilitative programs, restorative justice programs that they've been involved in at their units and how meaningful and helpful that's been to them. And I like the thought of incorporating that recommendation into into whatever we do, because I think that sort of program is super helpful to the extent we're pursuing a Second Look Act or pursuing a enhanced parole process, right? That these wonderful programs are relevant to that. So I just, to summarize kind of the recommendations they made, expand the STOP program, that's one of them. Expand the Bridges to Life program. Now, when I was at Prisoner Legal Services, I had a couple of clients write to me and tell me how meaningful that was to them. It's a restorative justice within the walls program. They'd like to review and expand the First Step Act, which is, I think, what we're looking at with sort of a Second Look Act. And then bring back presumptive parole and make it retroactive. I think we'll discuss that more in when we're looking at, how to go about this, right? Is it parole? Is it legislation? Is it some mix? But if you read Mr. Hart's letter, no, it's Mr. King's letter, I'm sorry. I wish I had it before my presentation last week because he very specifically describes the lack of process in the parole proceeding that I was trying to communicate. So I would encourage us to consider adding that restorative justice component to our prison recommendation, along with some of the things that we heard this morning. And I would encourage you all to take a look at these letters, and I'd like to kind of highlight them for the broader task force if we can. Just really, really thoughtful stuff.
I remember during Commissioner Ishii's presentation last week, I asked him about the Bridges to Life program at the Craggy facility in Asheville. I don't think we got a chance for the commissioner to respond to that. But like Mary, I've heard good things about that program. Saw that confirmed in Mr. King's letter, and just wonder how we can expand that to the other facilities.
What brought it home to me in particular was, we've had appropriately, I think, some discussion about and concerns from victims, right? And this restorative justice is a way to get their voice as well, in some respects. So
that's exactly right. I mean, that in the limited conversations I've had with victim or victim families that have communicated, that is one point of common ground. Where they say that the system does not permit enough opportunity for that kind of offender harm party interchange, demonstration of actual remorse and redemption. And just a footnote this, Working Group 3 is having a session tomorrow afternoon. Mercedes, I believe it starts at 4:15.
Yeah. Exactly, I was gonna make that reminder at the end of the meeting tomorrow. Yeah, Work Group 3 is assigned with to the restorative justice kind of topic as a whole. And so they are going to be having a discussion on it tomorrow at 4, I believe. And
I think one of the nation's just preeminent scholars and advocates on the issue of advocating for harmed parties, harmed communities is Danielle Sared. And she will be making an initial presentation during that session. And there's going to be follow-up from local North Carolina advocates on the subject. So I certainly plan on attending that program and would encourage others to do as well.
And Henderson, this is Jasmine. Working Group 3, explicitly invited other task force members to participate in that one in particular because they thought it would be useful for this working group in particular. So I wanted to co-sign what you just said.
Well, I regret that I did not think about these other prison issues before we drafted our recommendations. So I don't know if we go back and incorporate them. I know we're in a big hurry and we want to get all this finished. Maybe we incorporate them into what we've recommended, or maybe we do a separate little sort of, hey, here's some other things the prisons could do or DPS could do to help. I don't know. Anyhow, I've said that.
Honestly, Mayor, I think if we're all on board with it, there's still time to incorporate them to what's going forward to the task force. So if everybody's okay with, for example, saying, Mary, go ahead and type up what it is that you want in this document that we've got. If go ahead and input what it is that you want in the document directly, and I think tomorrow, I need to look at the schedule to see when we were going to have that task force survey go out. But in the next couple of days, if you input it in there,
okay.
I think
if I could have through close of business tomorrow, I've got some other things going on.
Okay. Yeah, so that should be okay, I think.
Thanks. Okay.
I'm remembering a conversation that Karen led at the very beginning of this process about consensus. And I can't help but think about the conversation we've had this morning and think that Working Group 4 has a general consensus about the importance of the recommendations that we've received from the collaborative, the importance of the 4 recommendations that come outside that collaborative. I believe we share a consensus on that, and I hate to put the burden on you, Mercedes, and the staff, but how do we bring this consensus to the attention of the task force for a well, or even not so well designed set of proposals is a challenge that we are leaving with you and Jasmine to help us with. But I do think there's a consensus. This is important. This is something we want to lift up to the task force, and we look to you to help us effectuate that.
And I think we only had 2 going to the survey results. We only had 2 people respond to the prison discipline survey. Mainly all in favor. There was some tinkering with the language on how far we want to go with the language. So if you'd like, I can pull up the prison discipline recommendation right now, and you can see, we had the comments about, do we want to use the term solitary confinement at all? And I think we don't. We want to stop using that term and just use the term restrictive housing when we're talking about what we're hoping to expand or transform the use of, right? So I think making sure we're clear on our language. So I've given some suggestions in here, mainly based on the comments that Henderson and others and Mary had provided in through the survey. And so Mary, if you want to come in here and kind of plug in where you think it makes sense, if it even means in creating an entirely new recommendation number, I think that's okay as well.
Okay.
And we can kind of work together and put it forward to the task force sometime later this week. And let me know if I can scroll up or down or talk about something specifically if you'd like.
I looked pretty quickly at the comments this morning, but was there anything controversial in there or that we didn't have consensus on?
No.
Or just how the language suggestions
exactly.
about language.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, yeah. Okay. Yeah. And
Well,
then
I think I can get something turned around, like I said, maybe by late tomorrow. And then Mercedes, if you wanted to circulate it back to this group before it goes to the, I'll work on that for you.
Okay, great. Great.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll clean up the language a little bit and get it circulated around one last time before going out to the task force. And then, so that was prison discipline. With fines and fees, that had already gone out to the task force. We did get some questions. I'm not going to take the time to pull those up. They got overwhelming support, but feel free, you guys, to go to that document and check out some of the comments that were made if you think that's appropriate. And then the last thing, let me pull up the slide one last time. I think the only other thing that we wanted to talk about, Henderson, was your draft recommendation that you've got in the works.
Right. Now I've drafted up a template that I think would be a helpful guide to our discussions about the death penalty. And Mercedes, what I'll do is email to you. Yeah, I've slightly edited the last draft that I sent to you. And we'll have that emailed around to the working group. It's a little bit different than some of the other templates in that it brings together some of the good work, some of the research that has been done on related subjects. And so we won't have we won't be picking up this discussion for 2 weeks. So I think it would be helpful if people would go through that template for 2 reasons. One, for us to find a voice that we're all comfortable with. And you'll see that this template is drafted sort of in my voice. And that may or may not be the voice that we want to carry on to the task force, to the larger task force. So there's the question of the tone and the voice that the template has. But equally important is a series of hot links that will direct you to important work, research work, and reports that have been done on the death penalty, and that I think are important undergirding for the recommendations that I think this working group and the task force should give very serious consideration to. The way we've got things planned is that we'll have a couple of weeks for members to review the draft. We'll be coming back with a presentation on the task force. I believe it's scheduled for the November 5th meeting, which Mercedes, I think my calendar suggests that's a Thursday, as opposed to our usual Tuesday meeting. Tuesday the 3rd is, of course, Election Day, and many folks will be otherwise occupied during our usual hour. So our meeting that week will be on Thursday the 5th. So please make a note of that. Please make a note of the special challenge that is given, that we reflect over some of the reports in that template, so that we can have as productive a conversation on the 5th as we can.
Henderson, is that document, is it on our what do you call that thing?
The SharePoint.
SharePoint. Is it on SharePoint?
Even this late in the process, I'm not that familiar with the SharePoint and what's on it. So what I've promised to Mercedes is I'm going to email her my latest draft of it, and she's going to either email it to the group and or include it on the SharePoint. But I think by the end of this morning, we'll have that draft to the members. And I think that's the most critical piece, that we have it to the members this morning, and folks will have a week or 10 days to review it, review the links to it, and participate in the conversation on Thursday the 5th.
And email's fine as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Mercedes and Henderson, I believe, Daniel, did you have another comment that you wanted to make?
Oh, yes, please.
Oh, thank you for that. Yes, so I was hoping to highlight the issue of pending charges, because I don't think it's sort of clear on its face what the issue is, and it's been a extremely persistent issue in the prison system and highly consequential. You know, these are what we looked at when we saw people in prison was that they were, and this is actually what the local reentry councils were reporting to us, that they'd be working with somebody for 2-3 weeks, and then they would get arrested because they'd be pulled over for speeding or something. They would do a warrant check and found out that the person had a 10-year-old warrant that they had been, they had been released from prison. The pending charge, the warrant, had been there the entire time, but was not important enough to the DA to sort of act on. And so that's a huge issue because it both facilitates unnecessary interactions between people released from prison and law enforcement, but also can be completely devastating. And also, not having pending charges is one of the criteria for release under the extended limits of confinement program. So that's another way that individuals are being hurt just because of this, of having these pending charges. And I want to also highlight that we tried to fix this in 2015 and actually passed a law called Facilitate Successful Reentry, Session Law 2015-48, that said the courts and DPS have a good faith duty to resolve these issues, to resolve these pending charges while somebody's in prison or before the court. And it just hasn't worked. And so now we're trying to look at efficient ways to do this, and really are looking at what they call the Data Integrity Project a couple years ago, where AOC facilitated a process with district attorneys to dismiss about 1.6 million pending charges. And that was just sort of an administrative issue. But that same process could be used with the help of Department of Information Technology to create a very efficient process to resolve a lot of these pending charges. So I just wanted to highlight that as a extremely consequential issue that has not lent itself to being solved.
Thank you for that, Daniel. I know that you mentioned it, but I would just highlight that this is one of the most traumatic things that can happen. The random application or enforcement of one of these remote charges from 10 years ago, that when one is stopped in a very innocent pursuit, to have this old charge come, not only does it create a source of pain and trauma and shock, but when I have gotten in touch with the situation, it has often led to an irrational escalation of the contact between the law enforcement officer who elects to pursue it and the individual who's going through this traumatic experience of having something uncovered 10 years later. And the consequences of that traumatic interaction are often just incalculable. And it's so random, so traumatic, and so avoidable. So I would really highlight that this is an incredibly important piece that needs to be corrected, and that would enhance public safety as well as reduce the racial disparities that we're focused on. So thank you for highlighting that, Danny.
Henderson, I'm going to have to go to our judges conference, but thank you. And we'll be in touch offline. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Well, good. And I guess the last point that I would make was something I think that Mary also noted. There are some individual programs at Department of Public Safety. I'm thinking of a parenting program at Women's Prison that was incredibly impactful for one client that I'm aware of, that allowed her to have physical contact with her two young children, young pre-adolescent. Well, actually, they were teenagers by the time the contact was had. But it enabled the restoration of a parental bond. And through that client, I learned more about how that same program was used by a community of women to improve the life of the client. And Mary and I had yet another client whose baby was separated from her at age 1. And actually, the working group heard from this client.
Melissa, why don't you speak to that a little bit, Melissa? Because I know that's a lot of the work that you do, if you can.
Yeah. So I'm assuming you're referring to the match program at the
Yes.
Yes, yes. And people's eyes just light up when they hear about Match. And, you know, it's great that it's at women's prison. It's unfortunate that's the only place it is, because clearly there's a need. And as you've been talking this morning, and thank you for the chance to listen in, it's just a reminder to me to be everything that's come up today, to think about that child-family connection. You know, you're talking about pending charges. So you suddenly have a dad who's home, who's been released, and now is going to go back because those pending charges weren't dealt with. I always look at it from the perspective of what does that mean for kids who had a parent back or back in the home and now are possibly going back to prison. And so looking at all of these issues with that child and family perspective and lens to think about it. The Match program, the parenting programs that are happening at DPS, I think all of those provide some wonderful opportunities, things that we oftentimes don't think about, but opportunities to support that relationship between that child and that parent. And what does it do for the parent in terms of giving them some goals and opportunities and things to work towards as they make their plans for release and about their plans with their child upon release. So we'd
Is that program generally available throughout DPS? I only heard about it through women's prison. How available, how accessible is Match?
Yeah, and Irene's probably better qualified. My understanding is that parenting classes are, some standard ones are being implemented within the prison, that in the past they're in the prisons, that in the past they've been somewhat piecemeal depending on who is running the prison or outside involvement. But my understanding is they're moving towards standardizing so that we're using some evidence-based programs. But that's not a guarantee. We did a pilot parenting program at Carteret Correctional the early part of 2019. And I had one of the fathers say he had been in 2 or 3 different prisons and there wasn't a parenting class. And I just thought that was so unfortunate that he had to come to several prisons to find a parenting class. But jails are the other part of that conversation, that parenting classes aren't necessarily happening in our jails, or they're very piecemeal, very much based on who can kind of make an in with the folks in the jail. So they may not be evidence-based. They may not even be a true parenting program. They're just some folk, not just, but they're folks in the community interested, and they put together a group. So I think there are lots of different pieces of this when we think about parenting and about that relationship between that child and the incarcerated parent.
I know that the Match program is only available at women's prison, which is a problem because they've moved so many women to Anson now. But the way the program works, I just want to talk a little bit about this because I think most people don't know. It's something that the women have to earn, right? So it's a behavior incentive, but then they're actually allowed to visit with their children. From what I understand, they almost have like a little apartment set up so that the child could come and they would spend the day together, and the mother could prepare a meal so they could share a meal together. Yeah. Really meaningful. And in Henderson I's, the mutual clients case, there was a volunteer from Charlotte who drove the baby every month for 10 years to visit with his mother. And it's just, it's a wonderful program. It needs to be expanded. And, you know, the other thing is men are parents too. And of course there's something special about the mother-child bond, especially in infancy, but it would be so wonderful if the men were able to have this sort of visitation and develop this kind of relationship with their children. So it's really an overlooked need, I think.
And when you look back at the recommendations that we offered some feedback on, much of that came from work that we've done at men's prisons, where you know, I think all of a sudden we've realized, oh gosh, men are dads and they have a role in the children's lives as well. That's a piece that's been overlooked. To go back to the Match program, definitely need for expansion, but also, you know, it's for women who, my understanding is, unless it's changed recently, it's for women who are serving longer sentences. So I think it's 7 years or longer. So, you know, if you happen to be a child who, gosh, you're unfortunate to have your mom in prison to start with, but she's there for quote unquote only 5 years, that may not be an opportunity for you. But for those children who fall into that category, they do get to spend that extended period with their moms in a space that looks like, you know, a living room, kitchen, where they can make cookies together, or a birthday cake, or do homework. And there's not an officer in there. There's a trained volunteer. So it's looking to create that home environment as best you can, obviously in a prison setting.
And just to add to that, in abuse, neglect, dependency cases, time is of the essence for these children. And when a parent or both parents are incarcerated, it's unfortunate. The bond is important, but I think access to services is also important, because when that parent is released, it's almost like starting at square one. I mean, it's day one when they're released, when so much time has passed, when this child has been in care, and this parent could have been working on services, could have had access. And I know it's difficult to think about and it requires a lot of funding and resources, but if there was some way to connect these parents with the necessary services as recommended by DSS or whomever, such that when they get out, they're in a better position, not only just to have a bond, but perhaps to reunify with that child.
Melissa, your comment reminds me of last week's presentation with Commissioner Ishii and Sheriff McFadden, and the seeming overlap between those two leaders about the need to be more involved with preparing detainees and prisoners to community return. And how do we create the links between detention facilities and prisons and community organizations and home. And I know that McFadden and Mecklenburg is interested in developing those ties. I think it's remarkable, it's noteworthy that that 7 African-American sheriffs were elected at the last cycle. And that's a symbol that a traditional law enforcement institution might have more sensitivity to these concerns than we've demonstrated before. I think that's an opportunity. And I think the challenge for Commissioner Ishii and some of these sheriffs are to collaborate and figure out how we can make best use of the time that we've got these detainees or prisoners in custody and chart the plan for these sort of constructive family repair operations.
Henderson, if I can I try not to impose on your time, but I really just want to follow up on what Judge Clark said to really emphasize what's at stake for people, because both the services and the opportunity to have any kind of communication, including visits, but any kind of communication with children ultimately plays into termination of parental rights. So what's at stake for these folks really is their right to even be a parent at all. And I just really want to emphasize how important what you're talking about is for these families.
I was going to add too about there was an SRCC recommendation that came from the Women in Incarceration work group that it would prevent the incarceration or give judges the discretion to not incarcerate anyone who's a primary caregiver, whether mother, father, or just any primary caregiver of a child. And unfortunately that would be a legislative change. And unfortunately it didn't advance, but that is a recommendation that from the SRCC.
And this is Jasmine. Irene, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Massachusetts also was the original, that's where that idea originally came from. So again, New England, Henderson.
Yes.
Right, you guys have about 3 minutes before, so any concluding comments from task force members and next steps?
I lose track of our time frame and how many meetings we have left, but the second look revisiting sentences portion is really important to me. And should I just draft something and send it around? And can we have that on our next agenda?
Well, it's timely that you bring that subject up. I believe our next session is dedicated to to returning to this discussion.
Okay.
I have followed up with Dr. Nellis, and she has agreed to work with us, and to have to me by Thursday a draft of a second look at template or proposal. So I'm hopeful that we'll have that draft on Thursday. As soon as I get it, I will circulate it to the members, so that on the Tuesday, we can have as robust a conversation.
Perfect.
About the Second Look Act and where we're at on that.
And this is Jasmine. Also on the staff side, we have been having conversations with stakeholders around various programs that are in place right now at DPS related to COVID, and what other opportunities there might be in addition to Second Look. To meet some of these goals. And so we'll bring those facts to you as well for your conversation. That was one of the reasons why we wanted to punt this to next week, so there'd be time to do all of this.
And there's an updated work schedule that I think the last email that I sent to you has a link to what we should be covering in the rest of our meetings that are coming up.
Apologize. If I read all my emails timely, I probably wouldn't ask these questions.
No, you're fine. You're perfect. It gives me an opportunity to say there's an updated work schedule. So check that out. And then offline, what's going to happen before our next meeting, there's a little typo in this slide, but ultimately I'm going to send you guys an email about reviewing the comments that the task force made on fines and fees survey. I'm going to ask you to review the finalized language for the prison discipline recommendations so that we can send those to the task force for a survey. And then
Karen, thank you for leading us back to this conversation. I think the last 15 minutes were among the most important 15 minutes of this morning's session. And we so appreciate you for bringing us back to that point and to Daniel's observation. Melissa, thank you for your contributions. And I think the encouragement that while there's work to do with DPS, the folks are looking at these incredibly important opportunities for transformation. And thank you for bringing that information to us. We've got a lot of work ahead of us for the next several weeks. But Mercedes, I think we've got a work plan that gets us to our goal. So keep communicating with Mercedes, with myself, with tweaks and suggestions on the path going forward. But I'm feeling good. Thank you so much. Have a good week. Bye-bye.